Welcome, everybody, to session 89 of Worlds of Speculative Fiction. I'm really looking forward to chatting with all of you about the books that we have lined up. This time, we are returning to the narrative universe comprising multiple worlds of The Witcher, this series by Andrzej Sapkowki. You notice that I've got 3 volumes here. We did an earlier session on the first 4 volumes, 2 of which are collections of short stories, 2 of which are actual novels. And what we have here are novels, or we could call them entries, you can number them in terms of novels 3, 4, and 5, or Witcher books, numbers 5, 6, and 7. And of course, that doesn't comprise the totality of the series, but these bring it to an end. And so I thought, this is already a lot of material. It would be good to just do these particular 3, and then later on down the line, we can do some of the prequel novels. One of them is not yet translated from Polish into English, so perhaps we'll wait until then. So what are the books that we're talking about? We have Baptism of Fire, which is the 5th book, the 3rd novel in the series. We have Tower of Swallows, which is the one that follows it, and then it all gets brought to a conclusion in Lady of the Lake. And I'm just going to point something out to you that you might find a little funny or quirky. So the books get longer as they go on. Can you see that? The first in that set is a certain length. The next one is even longer. The next one is even longer. They're not interminably long. We're talking about 300 and so pages, and then 400 and so, and 500 and so. So not too bad. About 1,200 pages of text written in fairly sizable print. So if these were in a different version, it might be a bit shorter. And these are really great, if you like the characters who were developed in the previous 4 books, Geralt of Rivia, Yennefer, Dandelion, Ciri. There's so many others as well that stray in and stray out, some of whom actually change or reveal who they actually are in these novels. You're going to really, really enjoy these. And so I should say something about, this is called Worlds of Speculative Fiction. This is the 89th session in the series. We began this back in 2016, and we're in the 10th year of this interactive series. So what is it? There's a focus on world building, that is narrative universes, looking at an author's work spanning, a number of novels or short stories or other entries. We do a lot of examination of philosophical themes, including characters and their ethics and things like that, and that's going to play a big role in these novels. We talk about metaphysical themes, epistemological themes, a number of other things as well. And if this was the first time talking about this author, we would do some biography, but we're not going to need to do that because we already had a previous session on Sapkowki a while back. So we can jump right into the world building, the characters, the plot, all these interesting features. And this began as an in-person series, the recordings of which you can find partnering with the Brookfield Public Library. When COVID happened and everything locked down, we shifted to an online version of this, and that's what we're doing right now. So in the online version, I will be presenting stuff to you for anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes. You're welcome to join me for the video premiere. You may be watching that right now, where I do live chat with anybody who's watching, and then we follow up with a Zoom conversation for people who are still interested in discussing the works. Obviously, after this is premiered, you can engage by making comments, and I'm usually pretty good about responding to them, and so we can continue the conversation. And it's Worlds of Speculative Fiction, so we cover everything from fantasy to science fiction to horror, weird tales, alternate history, utopian, dystopian stuff, and many others as well. So, we've got a lot of really interesting stuff. If you want to see previous episodes, there's an entire playlist that you can watch your way through. There's an online course where I house the videos and provide other resources that you might find useful. So, buckle in. We're going to talk a lot about all the things that are happening in this wonderful, wondrous, not always wonderful, sometimes very grimdark world of The Witcher. And we'll begin with delving a bit into the universe that we find the characters inhabiting. The world building that Sapkowki is engaging in these three last Witcher novels is pretty extensive. And we're going to talk about the, let's call it, map setting on the continent, and that's important. But we're also thinking about a couple other important features of this world that we get glimpses of. And there's never a narrator telling us from on high, and then this is the case, and this is the case. It's always being revealed in the course of the story. And it's a world that is definitely a fantasy world. We've just got this continent, many different kingdoms on it, lots of different kinds of peoples, including, of course, human beings, but also elves and dwarves and gnomes and halflings. And there's some bad blood between all of these and human beings. So there have been wars going on for a long time. And there's all sorts of other creatures as well, monsters of different sorts. There's dragons that we've encountered. Dragons won't play any role in these, but they did in previous ones. And there's lots of different kingdoms and lots of different people of all different walks of life engaged in, some of them just trying to live a life, some of them trying to get ahead commercially, some of them engaging in politics. There's magic in this universe. And here is the big reveal. By the time that we get to Tower of Swallows, we're actually going to be moving out of this particular world. And, we knew about this before, that human beings had entered into the world through something called the conjunction. They came from a different world, right? And then they kind of overran the place. But we're going to find out that there's many, 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 many different worlds, including in our own world, and that's going to come up in Lady of the Lake. And it's actually going to finish in a Arthurian world where Ciri is meeting up with Galahad and having a conversation with him. And he's saying, hey, let's go to Camelot. So there's all sorts of other places involved as well. So that's a second important feature. The other really important feature is that this is a world in which people reflect upon how things are arranged, how things happen. And so we're going to look at a lot of passages where this comes up. So let's attend first to the big, let's call it the foundation of this world. So we have kingdoms, and to the very south we have the Empire of Nilfgaard, who are, for a lot of this portrayed as sort of the big bad empire. It's going to be a lot more complicated than that, of course. And they have already conquered quite a few of the kingdoms to their north. And they have, their own language, as do, all sorts of other people. But there's kind of a common tongue that people speak. And then as we head north, we find all of these other kingdoms. By the time that we're getting to these novels, quite a few of them have already been conquered, right? Sintra is a great example. So that's where Ciri is originally from. That's where the Witcher, Geralt, gets connected up with the royal house of, Sintra. And, he connects up his destiny with that of Ciri or Cirilla. There's islands, there's an island kingdom, Skellige. There's Temeria to the north, Redania, another big, strong kingdom, Aedirn, Lyria, and the Rivia that Geralt actually says that he's from. By the way, one of the funny things that happens in Baptism of Fire is we find out that Geralt was never actually from Rivia. He just called himself that because it was good for business as a witcher, as a dispatcher of terrible creatures. And so he picked a name basically out of a hat. He winds up being knighted, Geralt of Rivia, by the Queen of Rivia, who is fighting against the Nilfgaardian forces. And so there's all sorts of places that they can go through. There's, the forest of Brokilon, where the dryads reign and live, and elves can go, right? We also have a kind of fairy tale kingdom of sorts in Toussaint, which is this wine-producing region. Turns out that Dandelion is actually a noble guy who has a very strong connection, which he screws up, of course, with the queen, the reigning person there. And it's like a land of chivalry and enjoyment and all sorts of things like that. But there's a major, major war going on as Nilfgaard is pushing north, conquering kingdoms, and as the northern kingdoms try to push back. Non-humans, for example, the elves, are fighting on the side of Nilfgaard because the Nilfgaardians can use them effectively as a wedge against the rather xenophobic humans from places like Sintra and Temeria and all of that. And a lot of places are kind of breaking down into brigandage and, chaos, right? So that's an important aspect of this. The multiverse thing, we're going to get into that a little bit more later on, so I'm going to reserve some of that. But I will just say this. Ciri, one of the main characters of this work, the Witcher girl, right, who is connected to Geralt and also to Yennefer, sort of their adoptive child, it's going to turn out that she is going to have the power to go between all of these different worlds. And there's a long part of Lady in the Lake where she is going from world to world to world, sometimes with terrible consequences. She actually ends up bringing a flea that is carrying a plague, which will, happen in this particular world. So we got a lot of stuff going on, a lot of different places, a lot of different settings, moving from place to place, trying to get across enemy lines. Geralt is seeking out Ciri, who thinks he thinks that she's down in the Nilfgaardian Empire, captured by the Emperor. She's moving all over the place. By the time that these stories begin, she is actually with a band of fighters, robbers, essentially, who, the squirrels who are not the squirrels. They're out there and they're fighting and robbing. Most of them are going to end up getting killed very early on in the story of Baptism of Fire and Tower of Swallows. So a lot of stuff going on. Now let's talk about the world itself and some of the pictures that we're going to get of it. So here's a really interesting description. This is in chapter 3 of Baptism of Fire. The old road had changed somewhat since the last time the Witcher had traveled along it. Once a level highway paved with slabs of basalt built by elves and dwarves centuries before, it had now become a potholed ruin. In some places, the holes were so deep they resembled small quarries. So why is that the case? Zoltan Shive, who's a dwarf, knew the reason for the road's desperate state of repair. Following the last war with Nilfgaard, the need for building materials had increased tremendously. People had recalled that the old road was an almost inexhaustible source of dressed stone, since the neglected road, built in the middle of nowhere, leading nowhere, had long lost its importance for transport and served few people. It was vandalized without mercy or restraint. Your great cities, the dwarf complained, were without exception built on dwarven and elven foundations. You built your own foundations for your smaller castles and towns, but you still use our stones for the walls, and you never stop repeating that it's thanks to you, humans, that the world progresses and develops. But you don't even know how to destroy things wisely, Zoltan griped. Why can't you remove the stones gradually from the edges of the roads? You're like children. Instead of eating a donut systematically, you gouge out the jam with a finger and throw away the rest because it's not sweet anymore. Geralt explained patiently that political geography was to blame for everything. The old road's western end lay in Brugge, the eastern end in Temeria, and the center in Sodden. So each kingdom destroyed its own section at its own discretion. In response, Zoltan obscenely stated where he'd happily shove all the kings and listed some imaginative indecencies he would commit regarding their politics, right? And so, this is an interesting commentary, is it not? The elves and dwarves were around long before the humans came. The humans are kind of, using their achievements, pushing them out, marginalizing them. A little bit later on, we're going to get a very interesting commentary happening. As a matter of fact, I think I will come back to this in just a moment, because it's about this group of witches that are, sorceresses that are going to do something quite important, and maybe we need to come back to that. So let's talk about what's revealed in Tower of Swallows. So the first thing is we're learning as Ciri is with Bonhart, this horrible fighting guy, and he's getting a sword for her from Esterhazy, right? And he tells her, Ciri, this is Esterhazy, come here, the girl with a collar on the neck, examine the marks etched in the blade. You don't understand them naturally, but I shall explain to you. Look, the line delineated by destiny is winding, but leads to this tower towards the annihilation, the destruction of established values, of the established order. But there above the tower do you see a swallow, the symbol of hope. Take this sword and may what is to come about, right? So hints that things are winding down, breaking down, right? A little bit later, we read Geralt is talking with this prefect, and we're going to get a really interesting discourse here. So the prefect says, know you, Master Witcher, I swore to myself the law would rule on my turf at any cost and using any methods, for the law is not jurisprudence, not a weighty tome of articles, not philosophical treatises, not peevish nonsense about justice, not hackneyed platitudes about morality and ethics. The law means safe paths and highways. It means back streets one can walk along even after sundown. It means inns and taverns one can leave to visit the privy, leaving one's purse on the table and one's life beside it. The law is the sleep of people certain they'll be woken by the crowing of the rooster and not the crashing of burning roof timbers. And for those who break the law, the noose, the axe, the stake, the red-hot iron, punishments which deter others. Those that break the law should be caught and punished using all available means and methods. Eh, Witcher? Is the disapproval written on your countenance a reaction to the intention or the methods? The methods, I think. For it is easy to criticize methods, but we would all prefer to live in a safe world, wouldn't we? Go on, answer. And here Geralt is going to say something really fascinating. He says, "The world you envision pleases me. The world you envision is made for a witcher. A witcher would never be short of work in it. Instead of codes, articles, and peevish platitudes about justice, your idea creates lawlessness, anarchy, the license and self-serving of princelings and mandarins, the officiousness of careerists wanting to endear themselves to their superiors, the blind vindictiveness of fanatics, the cruelty of assassins, retribution, and sadistic vengeance. Your vision is a world where people are afraid to venture out after dark, not for fear of cutthroats, but of the guardians of public order. For after all, the result of all great crackdowns on miscreants is always that the miscreants enter the ranks of the guardians of public order en masse. Your vision is a world of bribery, blackmail, and entrapment, a world of turning imperial evidence and false witnesses, a world of snoopers and coerced confessions, informing in the fear of being informed upon. And inevitably the day will come in your world where the flesh of the wrong person will be torn with pincers, when the innocent person is hanged or impaled, and then it will be a world of crime. In short, a world where a witcher would be in his element." Right? Very interesting conversation, isn't it? And what is the lesson there? Well, a lot of people are trying to make the world a better place. Are they succeeding? Not actually, because they generate more problems in their wake. We get another interesting conversation where Yennefer is talking with Sigdrilla, and here we go. Sigdrilla says, "I want to check what's deep inside you. Therefore I've brought you here to this place of power and might from time immemorial. Your priceless magic is apparently everywhere. Are then chaos, art, and learning, according to you, the powers capable of changing the world?" So this is a metaphysical question, right? A curse, blessing, and progress. And aren't they by any chance faith, love, sacrifice? So it's a question about, well, what actually drives things? And the answer is all of these things do. And she goes on and she says, "The wolf devours the sun, the moon turns black, there's only coldness and darkness, hatred, vengeance, and blood. Whose side will you be on, Yennefer? Will you be on the east or west side of Bifrost? Will you be with Heimdall or against him? Decide, Yennefer, choose. Only for this reason were you restored to life, that you might make a choice at the right moment." And she says, "Light or darkness? Good and evil, light and darkness, order and chaos, they are but symbols. In reality, no such polarity exists. Brightness and gloom are in each of us. A little of one and a little of the other. The conversation is pointless. Pointless. I will not come over to mysticism, to you and to Sigrifa. The wolf is devouring the sun. To me, it's an eclipse, and may it remain that way." So different interpretations of what's going on, many of which are much more black and white than those that, say, Geralt and Yennefer have. And we also find Ciri talking with this hermit who, takes her in after she's injured. Viscoda, he turns out to have been a doctor, right? And so we get an interesting contrast between them. She says, "You can sneer without having any idea how much evil you've done to the world, you aged scholars, you theoreticians with your books, with your centuries-old experience of reading moral treatises so diligently you didn't even have time to look out the window to see what the world was really like. You philosophers, artificially shoring up artificial philosophies in order to earn salaries at universities, and since not a soul would pay you for the ugly truth about the world, you've invented ethics and morality, nice optimistic sciences, except they're fallacious and deceitful." And he says, "There's nothing more deceitful than a half-baked judgment, miss. That's a hasty and incautious conclusion." And she goes on, "You didn't find a remedy for evil, but I, a callow witcher, have an infallible remedy." And what is her infallible remedy? Revenge. Answer me, why not? Why should I eschew revenge? In the name of what? Higher reasons? What's higher than an order of things where evil deeds are punished? To you, O philosopher and ethicist, revenge is an improper deed, reprehensible, unethical, and ultimately unlawful. And I ask, where is the punishment for evil? Who should attest it, adjudge it, and inflict it? The gods you don't believe in? The great demiurge creator you decided to replace the gods with? Or perhaps the law? Perhaps Nilfgaardian justice, imperial judgments, prefects? You naive old man, right? And he says to her, so it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, blood for blood, and for that blood, more blood, a sea of blood. Do you want to drown the world in blood? Oh, naive, damaged girl. Is that how you mean to fight evil, little witcher? And she says, yes, just like that. For I know what evil fears. Not your ethics, not sermons, not moral treatises about a worthy life. Evil fears pain, impairment, suffering, death, the end. When wounded, evil howls with pain like a dog. She goes on and says, then and only then does evil's hair stand on end and evil finally yell, mercy! I repent of my sins. I'll be good and decent now, I swear. Just save me. Staunch the blood. Don't let me perish ignominiously. And she says, that's how you fight evil. If evil wants to do you harm, inflict pain on you, anticipate it, ideally when evil isn't expecting it. If you were harmed by evil, pay it back. Pay it back twofold, threefold. An eye for an eye? No, both eyes for an eye. A tooth for a tooth? No, all its teeth for a tooth. Right? And so this is one of the responses to the breakdown that's happening within that society. I'm going to bring up just a few things, and we'll come back to the sorceresses in just a bit. This is from the end of Lady of the Lake, and we learn that Ciri is saying, I have to talk to Geralt to say goodbye to him. You know, she's being offered this kind of deal, right? And she says that I have to tell him I've understood, that I really know different now at this point, and I need to tell him that all this bloody destiny and good of the world are stupid platitudes, but it's important he understands and accepts it. And they go on and they make a important decision, and then we get to this other interesting, and I know I'm saying this word interesting a lot, but the Witcher is going to engage in some important reflection. He says, the evil I fought against was a sign of the activities of chaos, activities calculated to disturb order. Wherever evil is at large, order may not reign, and everything order builds, collapses, cannot endure. The little light of wisdom and the flame of hope, the glow of warmth, instead of flaring out, go out. It'll be dark, and the darkness will be fangs, claws, and blood. And then the Witcher goes on and he says, the reason for existence for Witchers has been undermined because the fight between good and evil is being waged on a different battleground now and being fought completely different. Evil has stopped being chaotic. It stopped being a blind and impetuous force against which a Witcher, a mutant, as murderous and chaotic as evil itself had to act. Today, evil acts according to rights because it's entitled to. It acts according to peace treaties because it was taken into consideration when treaties were being written. And they talk about what they're witnessing, all the after effects of the war, the people being driven out, the backroom deals, all of that sort of stuff. Now, who is going to fix that? Who is going to change that? So we find out that we could call it a great or grand conspiracy. Yennefer has been invited to this gathering of sorceresses. And she's told, we shall be taking part in a session of an organization that ought to interest you. After all, you are always of the opinion that magic represents the utmost value, superior to all disputes, conflicts, political choices, personal interests, grudges, sentiments, and animosities. Not long ago, The foundations of an institution were laid down. Something like a secret lodge, brought into being exclusively to defend the interests of magic, meant to ensure magic occupies the place it deserves in the hierarchy of the world. Exercising my privilege to recommend new members, I took the liberty of proposing 2 candidates, Ida Apsevni and you. And, they go on and explain what is supposed to be happening here. And a little bit later, she says, when I finally learn what you're trying to do here, I'll tell you what I agree with and what I don't agree with. And so we get this big reveal. Philippa began. She repeated the welcome and immediately got down to business. And we go through a little bit of, we call it paperwork. And we find out that in spite of the lodge's statutory political neutrality, sorceresses were unable to hide their views. Some were anxious about the close proximity of Nilfgaard. Fringilla had mixed feelings. She assumed such educated people would understand that the empire was bringing culture, prosperity, order, and political stability to the north. On the other hand, she didn't know how she would react if foreign enemies were approaching her home. And here's what they say about the war. No one is capable of predicting the outcome of this war. What is more, predictions of that kind are pointless. It's time we looked at this matter with a dispassionate eye. Now notice what she says. First, war is not such a great evil. I'd be more afraid of the consequences of overpopulation, which at this stage of the growth of agriculture and industry would lead to famine. Secondly, the war is an extension of the king's politics. How many of those who are reigning now will be alive in 100 years? None of them. How many dynasties will last? There's no way of predicting. In 100 years, today's territorial and dynastic conflicts, today's ambitions and hopes will be dust in the history books. But if we don't protect ourselves, if we allow ourselves to be drawn into the war, nothing but dust will remain of us too. If we look a little beyond the battle flags, if we close our ears to the cries of war and patriotism, we shall survive. Now, here's the crux. And we must survive. We must because we bear responsibilities not towards kings and their local interests focused on the concerns of one kingdom. We are responsible for the whole world, for progress, for the changes which accompany this progress. We are responsible for the future. Then we hear a different voice. Tiassa de Vries would have expressed it differently, Francesca Findebert said. She was always concerned with responsibility towards the common man, not in the future, but here and now. Right? So this is quite interesting. There's more debate about this. And what are they all trying to do? Figure out a way forward. And so many are trying to determine ways forward, and they're all at counter purposes with each other. Not only, by the way, those in this world, but also those, as we're going to find out a little bit later, we're going to delve into this, in the other worlds, where they're even concerned about the world of the Witcher, in which all of this stuff is happening. So, a lot of really interesting world building taking place, but it's a morally, we could call it, infected world, not just a place with maps and rivers and mountains and monsters, but one that's very complex, isn't it? As we're looking at these 3 final novels of the Witcher series, which draw it to a successful close, I think one of the themes that we absolutely have to talk about is the literary structure of them as we're moving forward from Baptism of Fire all the way to Lady of the Lake. And the reason I want to bring this up is because Lady of the Lake gets so weird in how it's written, not in terms of style, but in terms of point of view, and it's ever expanding. So Baptism of Fire, pretty straightforward in the respect that we're doing point of view characters. There's essentially two main storylines going on, that concerning Siri, well, actually three. So Siri is a really major part of it. She has, joined this group, the Rats, at the end of the previous novels, and they are engaging in all sorts of marauding and fighting against different people. And she's this Witcher girl who is being hunted down by others, but has found a band to be with, and so she's kind of developing, right? And then we have Geralt, and, there's a really important theme that we're going to come to later of having an actual company. He is trying to seek out Ciri, who he thinks is way down south in Nilfgaard. There's a war going on. He's trying to get across the lines and not get too wrapped up in stuff. And he draws a bunch of people to him, his companions. So there's that going on. And then we do have the beginning of the League of Sorceresses with Yennefer. But this is, concentrating on those characters. It's written in the same way that the other Witcher novels and short stories were. Now, when we get to Tower of Swallows, the story starts to expand a little bit more in terms of who's being brought up, who's being narrated. So I'm going to mention very early on in it, we get this scribe, Jare, who's going to show up a little bit later, and Triss Marigold, a character we were introduced to before, who's not just a secondary character. She's in between a primary and secondary character. Actually, she had some of her own point of view things in the earlier novels as well. And then we get something that's a really interesting twist in the storytelling. So we have this character, Visogota, who is a hermit living down in what's now occupied territory. The Nilfgaardian Empire has encompassed it. And he was actually from the Nilfgaardian Empire. As we're going to learn, he was a doctor, he was a professor, and he takes in Ciri, right? And so we get a lot of interesting storytelling in the interplay between Visogota and Ciri, as each of them are telling their stories to the other and taking care of each other. And he's going to die. He's an old man. He'll have a heart attack towards the end of the book, long after Ciri has left. So that's an interesting feature of this. It's story within story. It's using some, fairly standard narrative techniques that go all the way back, say, to the Odyssey, right? Let me tell the story of how I wound up here. But we also get chapters that are point of view chapters that aren't about Ciri or Yennefer or Geralt, right? So, for example, chapter 8 begins with Diskra, who is, this spy master for the Redanians, and we get this whole interesting disquisition on how Redania was treating the countries in the north as part of its fiefdom, and how Kovir and Povis, gradually extricated themselves from it, and we get, some exposition here, and eventually we're going to come back to Dijkstra and what he is up to and what he's doing, talking with the Count, his ventures. And so, this is quite interesting, isn't it, to find out that there's more and more scale for this. We're gradually expanding the scope. And Ciri and Geralt are all absolutely central, but we're getting more of the picture being drawn. And that becomes even more the case in Lady of the Lake, a much longer novel. I'm going to bring up a few interesting features from this. So we've got, instead of just having like all the things, let's say, synchronically, so we're getting a better picture of what's happening from the same time, now we're actually jumping into not only other worlds, but other times. So we get quite a few of these things that are focused on this woman, Kon Wierimers, who is a dreamer. And she is there with the Fisher King and Nimue, and the goal is to try to figure out what actually happened in the legends, at this point in time, legends about these characters like Geralt and Yennefer and Ciri and Dandelion, right? So she engages in this sort of thing, and this is like a way of doing research, establishing the truth. And obviously this is happening later on. We get another interesting point of view chapter in chapter 4 with this Fringilla Vigo, who is also telling her story, which coincides with Geralt, because they've decided that she is going to seduce and keep occupied Geralt in Toussaint, so that he will essentially be taken off of the chessboard, you might say. And she's telling this story to Philippa Eilhart and the rest of this league, right? So some really sophisticated storytelling techniques going on there. We have some other interesting bits, later on a little bit. We see Skellen talking with, a number of other people, having a meeting at Toussaint and all of that. And, these are important characters. And Geralt is actually overhearing them as they're chatting about stuff. Two other passages that I thought would be interesting to bring up. So chapter 6 is essentially a point of view chapter about this guy who we encountered earlier at this temple, Jara. And he has decided to leave the temple and join up. And we get an entire chapter about, what it is for this naive young man who falls in with a bad lot, and also, in some respect gets saved by the Landesknechts and becomes part of the infantry, as well as the story of his ne'er-do-well companions who try to rob and rape a family of halflings, who then kill them and bury them out the back along with the other people like that. Chapter 8, we have an entire discussion, depiction from the point of view of a lot of the people who are involved in these wars, right? We also get Jarre, we get all these other characters, and it's leading up to what is going to be this decisive battle. Now, the last thing that I do want to say is that there is a great battle that is, going to change the feature of things. The Nilfgaardians are going to be beaten back by the northern forces. There's also a great battle that's happening in terms of Ciri's disposition. She's been captured by Vilgefortz and all of his companions, you could say, the renegade Nilfgaardians. And Geralt and his companions go in. Many of them get killed. And then the Nilfgaardian forces with the Emperor show up at the last minute as well. So there's really two major decisive things. The story doesn't end there. As a matter of fact, there's about another 120 pages of the aftermath of all of these things, ultimately leading to what happens to Geralt and Yennefer and Ciri, but also a lot of other people who are involved with them. Characters who are out for a while come back in. The dwarves, for example, who Geralt and his companions were connected up within Baptism of Fire, and to some degree still in Tower of Swallows. And so it shows a different kind of, let's say, thematic namely that the big battle doesn't actually resolve everything. Evil's still there. Evil just changes its face. And I think this is really quite important, and it's a deliberate, I would say, way of narrating the story. And it looks like there's a lot of different perspectives, things are called into question, and the whole tale is going to end with a conversation between Ciri, who's now in a different world, talking with Galahad, who wants her to come to Camelot. And, she is narrating this story to him. And, he asks, is that the end of the story? And she says, not at all. Would you like the story to end like that? Like, hell, I wouldn't. And how is the story actually ending? Well, in a way that's fake, false, right? But represents hopes for the good. He asks, so what happened then? We're talking about Yennefer and Geralt. Nothing special, she snorted. They got married. Tell me. Aha, what is there to tell? There was a great big wedding. They all came. Dandelion, Mother, Nenneke, Eola, and Urnid, Yarpen, Zingrid, Vesemir, Eskel, Cohen, Milva, Angulem, and my missile, and I was there. I drank mead and wine. And they, Geralt and Yennefer, had their own house afterwards, and were happy, very, very happy. Like in a fairy tale. Do you understand? And what we're learning as we hear this, right? So Dandelion is still alive, Mother Nenneke is still alive, but Milva and Angulem have died, right? We know that, so we know that this is, as she's going to say, this is like a fairy tale. And Galahad says, it was a very strange story, very strange, But astounding adventures also happen here in our world. Take, for instance, what happened to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or to my uncle, Sir Bors and Sir Tristan. Just consider, Lady Ciri, Sir Bors and Sir Tristan set off one day for the west towards Tintagel, and she tells him, Galahad, just be quiet. It's an end to the storytelling that's going on. So, is Sapkowki trying to make some big grand point about the nature of stories or anything like that? Given the interviews, which we're going to look at shortly, that he's given, I don't think that's the case. I think he just sees that there's potential for taking and reworking these stories in a way that really, really works. And so he'll take whatever tropes and techniques he wants to, in effect, tell a really great story that sucks us in. So I thought that was worthy of at least some discussion here. Whenever we're afforded the opportunity to learn from the author, him or herself, about their works, their thoughts, their processes, their intentions, it's always well worth going into that because it tells us so much about the books that they write in the narrative world and the philosophical themes and why they're there. Now, we've already looked at some interviews with Sapkowki in the past, but we're going to look at a number of more recent ones and those in which he is revealing things about these books. There will be some spoilers ahead, so, forewarned. And we're going to begin with the Luca Comics 2015 interview. So he's being asked about Lady of the Lake, the 7th book in that series, the 5th of the novels, the Pentatad. And he's asked, I know, but would you tell us something about this book, what it meant to you? Was it a hard book to write or not? And he says, well, it meant for me more than 7 years of a hard work, starting with the first book of the saga and ending with the Lady of the Lake. It meant for me a real tough work. And in Poland, this was the first fantasy saga at all. It was my ambition to do something like this to Polish fantasy. And people laughed at me and said, you have no chance at all. Your business is short stories, just one book, maybe a second book. For the series, we have Americans like Brooks, we have Tolkien. They said, no, there's no place for Polish in business. They said, looking into my eyes. And I asked, why? They answered, because you're the worst. You're the worst. Tolkien is good. Brooks is great. Their endings are great, but Polish are not. So kind of a funny place to start. And then another interview called Don't Be a Curva Like Geralt. He's asked, aren't you bored yet of the Witcher saga? And he says, well, why would I be? Zelazny wrote 10 Ambers, Eddings, 10 Belgorods, plus Malorins, Brooke, 8 Shanaras, Donaldson, 6 Covenants, Foster, 8 Spellsingers, and I should get bored by a story in 5 small parts? Funny. It means that the question would be funny if I did not understand your wishes. And I understand. Now notice what he's going to say here. You are bored with it. You are tired with it. You would like to receive a short and action-packed short story every month. I admit I was once fed up with the nights and days. I left it, and though I'm ashamed, I still do not know what happened there with Bogomet and Barbara. I know a lot of people who threw Tolkien away after reading 3 pages of text and consider all fantasy fans idiots, all right? So, very interesting remark there. In the 2008 Fantasy Mundo interview, he's asked another very interesting question. Do you believe that time could convert the world of Geralt de Rivia into one of the great sagas of fantasy literature? And Sapkowki says, well, to say that the saga of Geralt de Rivia is going to end up being one of the great ones of fantasy would be immodest on my part. Of course, I have done what I've been able to do. In Poland, I've placed the first stone, certainly, and now there are many authors that are learning to do the same. Perhaps after my death, which could be near, some critics will place me on that list of the best of fantasy, like David Pringle did in his 100 Best Books of Fantasy, where all are Anglo-Saxons, except for Patrick Suskind and his Perfume and Michael Ende and the Never-Ending Story. Many critics have said to my face, we don't like Eskimos writing about zebras, and now they are the zebras. Time will tell. So moving on a little bit, we get a really funny, I would say refreshing exchange in the Luca Comics interview where he's asked, so is Lady of the Lake the last book of the saga, or are you planning to do more chapters in the future? And Sapkowski says, why should I do that? The end is the end. And then they say, because people want it. And he says, the people. No, it's me who decides, and nobody can make me do something I don't want to do. Of course, I wrote a side work, The Season of Storms, that hit the Witcher saga. Season of Storm is a side story where you'll meet some of the characters of The Witcher, but this saga is ended. Now I can write as many side stories as I want, and I will do it, because according to my information, the new regime in Poland and its Ministry of Culture will not pay for my event. So he's saying, I need to make some money. In a Meet the Author online interview and Q&As, he's asked, now this is going to be giving away some spoilers. In the 5th volume of the Witcher saga, that is Lady of the Lake, the heroes accompanying our brave monster killer die in less than an hour and in the same place. The dying characters were polished by you sometimes throughout the entire saga. Many details contained in their fate predicted a pretty good future, and then suddenly they die out of the blue and in quite controversial ways. My question is, why? Why are such intricate characters killed right away? Death is inflicted on them in bulk. Is it because you had to get rid of the excess of heroes? I understand that this is sometimes necessary, but was it possible to come up with some more subtle way than an ordinary skirmish and in a few cases stupidity that none of the readers would have expected? Doesn't this episode reveal any of your hidden sadistic inclinations towards the reader? I bet that after the death of Cahir, half of your admirers could not recover for half an hour while the other half for another hour. So here's what Sapkowski says. First of all, I did it for you and other readers who reacted in a similar way, to excite them, to provoke a reaction, to give them a hot roast, not a bland soup. Secondly, I did it as part of a long war with the fantasy stereotype, with the banality of the final duel on the Black Citadel, politicized and calculated on the so-called young adult's banality. Third, all the characters mentioned above are background characters, so contrary to your suppositions and accusations, I did not break any literary convention and did not commit any technical offense, because the background characters are to be killed slowly. So that's an interesting thing. Let's pause on that a moment. We are introduced to these characters along with mostly what Geralt is doing. Are they actually background characters? Well, one of them we certainly saw before as an antagonist, and that's Cahill, right? And then we have Regis, this vampire, seemingly a pretty important character, accomplishes a lot. We have these two women, Angoulême, who's kind of, a sweary broad, right? And we have this really well-developed archer character as well that, Geralt is going to meet up with and travel with for a while. And we're going to talk about this. There is indeed a fellowship formed, but who are the main characters? We're going to come back to this in a moment. It's a triad of Geralt, Yennefer, and Ciri. Even Dandelion is an important character, but he's not as important as it's going to turn out as Ciri or Yennefer, right? So coming back to this, he's going to say there's a fourth. The fourth is addressed to you, the asker of this question. The fact you did not sense how all the unfortunates from Stig are being led by death, I accept. Mea culpa. Apparently the text is not as clear as I thought. But as far as the rest is concerned, you did not read it clearly. What is strange about Milva's death? The Lord God is carrying arrows. It's an announcement of a damned fire weapon with which any fool can bring Hercules down. In addition, Milva dies of the nobility I command so that the rest, including the wounded Angoulême, her eternal antagonist, can escape from the hail of arrows. Cahir, the knight and officer, dies of nobility and love because he defends Ciri. Will the knight and officer defending his lady run away because he will decide soberly and thinkingly it's unwise to fight, even if the opponent is the Bonhart type? Bonhart, by the way, very, very dangerous fighting man, right? That would knock the whole legendary story and the whole matière de la chevalerie, right, the matter of chivalry off the ground. It couldn't be like this, and apart from the fact that the living Cahir was not fit for further action. Angoulême, I admit, dies stupidly. In other words, just as 90% of those who lost their lives died in such battles. Again, let's pause on that for a moment. So there's a lot of stupid dying that happens in these novels. Some people might say that's, grim dark or something like that. But, this is something where modern fantasy, I would say, has managed to, really capture something essential. You see this in George R. R. Martin. You see this earlier in Ursula K. Le Guin. You see this in, Stephen Erickson, right? Not every death is a great heroic death. Some of it is stupid. A lot of it's stupid, right? So going on. He says, for Regis, I admit, it was more difficult, and the versions in which the vampire survived existed. I resigned from them, however. Nevertheless, I consider it not a mistake, but also hurtful to accuse me of, as you write, getting bored with the hero or getting rid of excess. The vampire dies because he sacrifices himself to save Geralt and Yennefer. To kill him, Vilgefortz must severely shoot him out himself with his sorceress power. Going on. Coming back to Regis, right? He's asked by another person to meet the author, is the vampire Regis your alter ego? Such a little self-irony more towards yourself than the readers. Is this how you see yourself in the world you created? This is not such an infantile question. Most of the characters in your universe have been endowed with an unquestionable intelligence. And he says, well, Thank you for the flattering notion that if any of my characters has an above-average intelligence, it's probably a hit in me. Unfortunately, the truth is painful. Neither Regis nor any of my other characters is my alter ego or someone else's caricature. I am not in the habit of playing such games. I do not acknowledge jokes that are only funny to the author, for their punchline is only readable to him. I do not lack irony and self-deprecation, but I have plenty of other ways to use them. The plot of the book is decisive. Every event and every character must serve my story, even if only as an ornament, but still. We come back to Regis in the Fantasy Mundo interview, where they say, my favorite character is Emil Regis. With him, you confirmed an ideal which I'd read reading your books. Your writing is a, quote, point of encounter as much for the fans of fantasy as the black novel like The Terror. Did Regis arise from the rich Slavic mythology of vampires? And so Sapkowki says, well, actually, all is to the contrary. Regis does not exactly limit itself to any of the existing vampire legends. That's what's so interesting. Of course, until when the famous Polish professor Maria Janion has written an enormous book on vampires and literature, she uses Emil Regis as an example. Emil was a particular manner of demonstrating my personal vision of fantasy. Besides, he's not the typical vampire bloodsucker, according to the dictates of the canon. But inside the canon, there's always the space to be original if you have talent. And if not, well, you can go crap in some wooded place. In the Luca comics interview, talent is going to come up again. He's asked, the Witcher universe is gorgeous and full of characters. What was your inspiration for the political net and political background of the saga? He says, well, inspiration is overrated. There's nothing in inspiration, nothing. Either you're talented or you're not. And you are. Yes, I am. You know, inspiration is using words that really means nothing. There's nothing but hard work, but sometimes some critics try to find parallels between the Witcher universe and some events in our political world. They always try to find something it's not in my books, but it suits them. So that's just coincidences? Coincidences and nothing else. My books are just work that have no skeletons in the closet, no politics, stuff here and there. No, just my talent. Somebody likes the fact that someone is always looking for hidden things in my stories, but there's nothing. And then in the Don't Be a Curva Like Geralt interview, we get this question coming up again. Do the main figures of the Witcher world have their prototypes in the real world, in your near or far environment? And he says, there are no prototypes or analogs. No illusions, only my imagination, always. I'm sick of idiots, even those who are considered fantasy connoisseurs, who forcibly seek for postmodernism in my work, falsely understood as allusions to topics raised by the media and the so-called fashion. Those critics are trying to show what a primitive conjurer I am. That's really not true. Please do not look for copies and alter egos of Stalin, Beria, and Napoleon among my heroes, and among the situations described by me among the dialogues which I do not lead myself with but lead my heroes. Please do not look for my personal manifestos and political declarations. Literature, in my understanding, is neither a tribune nor a confessional. It's not even a bench in Hyde Park. Write down, please, the golden words. Only bad books talk about what their authors are. Good books say what their heroes are. The postmodernist thing comes up again in a deep discussion about the Witcher interview. So it reads, critics love to pin labels and names, and so Masiak called you a postmodernist at one time. It's hard to tell where he caught that mental plague from. In any case, critics use it to describe two occurrences. First, the commercial mix of threads that were already used many times in supposedly mind-shattering works. Second is replacing the message contained in the work itself with some mumbo-jumbo mixed from all sorts of ideologies and cultures. What's up with Sapkowski's postmodernism after all? Seriously or not, did you feel offended by the label? And so Sapkowski says, I don't even know if any definition of postmodernism has anything to do with real life. As for my work, it's a forced label. The reason is simple. Postmodernism, Positivism, neoclassicism, or God only knows what cultural revolution is only the case when the author intended it, usually in a specific social or artistic goal, sometimes a commercial one. Putting labels on others, what critics do, and their trait is that sometimes they're wrong and sometimes they're absolutely hilarious. Thanks to them, authors get bloated like Eagle, like Moliere's character, when they found out that they speak in prose. It's actually happened to me that I've left my work at Fantastica and the editor wrote prideful in place of my arrogant, or I desire you instead of I want to bang you. And later, after being honestly surprised, he wrote that my vocabulary got better. There are also those who claim that at first I wrote classic fantasy and then I became a postmodernist. That's not true. Now, in a longer interview with Stanislaw Barras called History and Fantasy, we get an interesting turn towards female characters. He says, your female characters are quite feisty. Very often they're warriors like men, a girl with a gun. This is a product of the 20th century, especially popular. Your books say that this is not a modern notion, that it's always been so. What do historical sources say about this? And Sapkowki says, in my novels, I use historical information mixed with legends. Speaking of female warriors, one should start with the undoubtedly existing Amazons. The only question is it really the kind that Homer describes? There are many legends about the warlikeness of German and Celtic women. Some authors doubt the truthfulness of the accounts of the warrior maidens, pointing out issues about weight and weapons and all that. I consider such an opinion to be erroneous and stupid, based on legends depicting every ancient warrior as a giant and a hero, which is totally contradicted by history. Big men were fighting, short men were fighting. There were women strong like Gorpins. Today, women are breaking records in sports, and in fact, sports are mostly born of martial arts. Another problem concerns social roles. Someone, after all, had to become pregnant and nurse children, stay at home. Men did not do this, but not because they were lying belly up and lashing beer. They had other jobs. History knows cases where women were forced to take up arms, and they did not do so badly. So it goes on a little bit further, and he's asked, but your work is directly nipped in a positive sense by belligerent women. And he says, yeah, that's true. And this is another proof that my Never Never Land has nothing to do with historical reality. Thanks to the fact that I removed the church from the world I built with all its prohibitions, it no longer looks like the Middle Ages. People already paid attention to the large number of female characters in my prose. Someone even said they became almost iconic in feminist circles, right? And then it's pointed out, feminists are not among your devoted readers. And he says, really? So someone tried to give me an undeserved compliment. But this doesn't change the fact that my approach to the female problem is marked by a certain ambiguity. Using various sources, I decided for myself, though I'm not a blind admirer of this theory, that the feminine element is dominant in nature. If there is a cult that's not connected with politics, it's the cult of the great mother goddess. Faith in the male god Yahweh, revered by the Jews, had a political background. And he says, I emphasize I don't defend these theses from the position of a religious scholar. Just for me, it's convincing. And it's on this basis I decided to play a similar idea in my work, partly from a historical point of view, bringing everything to the point of absurdity. That's why in my books, the world is dominated by a lodge consisting exclusively of women, sometimes speaking about men quite unflatteringly. In their opinion, politics and government are too serious questions to entrust them to emotionally unstable men, subject to various influences who cannot bring anything to the end unreasonably. So, this is kind of an insidious literary game, right? In a Meet the Author, we're going to shift topic a little bit here. He's asked, are series travels related to traveling in the shadows? Roger Zelazny's 10 books on Amber and the Courts of Chaos. And was the passage of Ciri through the Tower of Swallow a passage through the pattern? Did you rely on Zelazny's work when writing the saga? And Sapkowki says, well, of course I knew and like the Amber series very much. I never hid the fact that Roger Zelazny was an example of literary mastery for me. I read it long before my own debut as a writer, to which he largely inspired me. However, let me note, Seriously, that fantasy and the mythical literature of the root is simply full of such shadows, patterns, parallel worlds, and thousands of ways to teleport. Nobody can claim a monopoly here, so I reject the suspicion of influence. My towers and series abilities, even if not unique, are, in my opinion, mine enough. So much that I will remind everyone of Michael Moorcock's disappearing tower without fear, seemingly even more similar to the Tower of Swallow than the pattern, right? We get some stuff about Geralt himself that is quite interesting in the Don't Be a Curva like Geralt. He's asked, how old is Geralt? According to our questions, about 45. And Sapkowki says he's, during baptism of fire, over 50. But I won't tell you his exact age. Witchers get older longer than ordinary people and less noticeable than ordinary people. The Witchers who's 60 years old will not look older than 45. True, in the Witcher world, the average age of people is greater than in our Middle Ages, but even so, there would hardly have been a wet case of fighting monsters for a grandfather for 50. Therefore, Geralt hides his age. In the Claren interview, he's asked, the Witcher confronts very hard moral decisions. How would you describe Geralt in this sense? And so Sapkowki says, Geralt is a fictional character in which I tried to escape the stereotypes. He is complex, distanced from the cliches, and not at all flat. That makes him interesting. I tried to do that in many ways, and one of them was forcing him to make decisions, sometimes good ones, sometimes bad ones, sometimes doubtful ones, sometimes controversial ones. Is there morality? Let the reader judge. Now, that's a great line, right? Saying, I'm not going to give you all the answers. You read the books. You figure this stuff out. In Stanislaw Barris's History and Philosophy, coming back to that, he says, the Witcher tends to the idea that people are worse than monsters. And isn't the sympathy for dragons and elves the reverse side of your frustration in humans? Misanthropy is not uncommon among fiction writers. And Sapkowki said, the fact that humans are considered a race full of stupid, dark, spiteful, aggressive, ignorant, narcissistic, aspiring to self-destruction and to destruction people is no misanthropy. This is evidence of a well-developed observational body. And then the follow-up here is, well, the heroes of the Witcher cycle are not only people, but also non-humans. It's interesting that they use the word people for humans, right? Despite this, a universal moral philosophy applies to them. It doesn't matter what side you stand on, no matter how much you resemble a person. You can be a dwarf, elf, gnome, dryad, dragon, even a vampire. That you were courageous, just, and guided by the principle, don't kill for your own pleasure. However, a good wolf is something fundamentally different from a good man. So is this not excessive propaganda of human moral principles? And Sapkowki just says, no. And that's great, because that is sort of a, precious posturing kind of thing. And the follow-up, but we've established that Geralt, like you, sympathizes with non-humans. If I were you, I would have told him to step on the right side, because no matter what, he comes to the conclusion that it's not monsters, but humans who crap on our world. And so here's what Sapkowki says. Geralt, despite all his emotionality, is a reasonable and pragmatic person. He realizes the senselessness of some actions. He knows that certain processes are inevitable and cannot be reversed or stopped. The motive of the transience of the original world is present everywhere in the literature of fantasy. A greedy human comes into the thickly forested country of elves and destroys everything that's meaningful and holy for other races. This is the image created by who? Tolkien. A story about an Arcadia into which a demon enters. In other varieties of fantasy, evil is given a civilizational character, and usually it's embodied in itself by some mighty but infamous magician who decided to freeze or turn an idyllic country into stone. Such eloquence is often characteristic of descriptions of poisoning, life-giving rivers, or destruction of sacred groves. We know that Tolkien missed and mourned the time when the squirrel could run from Kent to Wales through the trees. I don't know if there's even one tree left between Kent and Wales, right? So that's, an interesting point. Coming back to a different topic with the same interview, Borges asks him, why was it so important for you that Geralt and Yennefer could not have an offspring? Is this a desire to demonstrate the laws of the genre or the contrary? It seems to me the second is more likely because a killer and a pregnant sorceress is a grotesque picture. And Sapkowki says, well, I could easily afford it, but somehow it happened at some point. In one of the first stories, Yennefer takes part in the dragon hunting, so I needed some motive that was not oversaturated with philosophizing, explaining why she, who considers herself almost a representative of the elite, is hanging out with this witcher. I also looked for a simple and true reason for the conflict between her and Geralt. I didn't have much time to decide this because the stories don't take a decade to write, and they're not discussed with literary critics in order to choose the optimal form and design. Typically, this requires 2 to 3 months of work, and the first idea is usually the best. The commissioning of the sorceress was aimed at another violation of the laws of the genre. A woman appears, and the reader, brought up on classical patterns, is convinced she will become a prize for the warrior. And suddenly, it turns out, Yennefer does not intend to be someone's prize, although she's by no means a nun and not an anachronist. From this beginning, further vicissitudes of the connection between the sorceress and Geralt emerged, although, as I said, I wasn't sure about continuing this storyline. I didn't know if I was going to use this character again, or more likely this lady would do what she's supposed to do and disappear, but some of the heroes, initially supposed to be one-time episodic, don't want to peel off from the writer's plan. The writer wants to stay with them a bit longer because they are, in short, interesting. Then here's the follow-up question. But you will agree it's a strange family. The aging, sterile, macho Geralt, the sterile sorceress Yennefer after the twists and turns, the bisexual orphan Ciri with titanic powers that don't protect her or her loved ones from anything. Family ties here are invented or imposed from above, and all participants in the system play something and drop out of their roles, and somewhere in the basis of this triangle, there's the writer's fear that father, mother, and daughter is a flimsy foundation to build a novel cycle on it. But why not? And so Sapkowki says, because it's too stupid and too primitive. Writers should write about unusual things. Intrigues must be twisted and tangled. The characters extraordinary and uncommon. Write about a grandmother, grandfather, father, mother, son, and daughter. And perhaps in every sentence to prove, and in the epilogue to seal this monstrous sextet as the main unit of society. Let's leave that, my dear, to the author of the scripts for TV shows. And then we get a final question about this. Geralt is white-haired. Ciri ashen-haired, Yennefer raven-haired. Is this a conscious decision or an accident? So Sapkowki says, Yennefer and Geralt, a symbolic contrast of black and white, like yin and yang, a visualization of opposites, which helps the reader understand this full of conflicts, violent love. Ciri is gray, a bit like Gandalf. Gandalf the Grey becomes white for he passes the rite de passage, the rite of passage. In anger, parodies Saruman, who argues that it serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed, the white page can be overwritten. Ciri at the end of the novel is a white sheet which can be covered with letters. As for what and how this sheet will be written, I leave the reader in ignorance so that he can think about it. Coming back to the Fantasy Mundo interview, they say, seeing the triangle which Geralt, Yennefer, Ciri form, I could not avoid seeing in them the sketch of the traditional Western family. Had you already a preconception of a pseudo-familial development for these characters? Did the idea emerge little by little? And Sapkowki says, the first thing I did was to fight against the stereotype, to present the typical hero who seeks a reward, who saves the World Trade Center Tel Aviv, who has all the women which he wants. I've altered the myth. This is a hero which says, don't screw with me, don't bother me anymore. To place this hero in front of different situations, such as with a woman, which also departs from the stereotypes, could be very harsh, but also very interesting. Then Fantasy Mundo asks another really interesting question. Judging from the apocalyptic tone which presides over your books, I have the impression you are, in truth, about a clash of civilizations. Can one understand the saga of Geralt, the Rivia, as an elegy? And Sapkowki says, yeah, absolutely. Perhaps my case is not so extreme as that of Tolkien. He suffered a hecatomb from his youth, World War I, and he spoke of pollution and poisoned rivers. I'm now 60 years old. Many of the living things which I've known have disappeared, animals, plants, insects, crustaceans, from what there was when I was 10 years old, already not remaining. It is a disaster, and all that has occurred in the course of one man's lifetime. What can happen here in 50 years? Perhaps all will disappear, and the world will be reduced to ashes. Thinking of it terrifies me. And this, the environmental destruction, is indeed one of the main themes running through these books, one of the themes that is motivating the need to get a hold of Ciri and attach this elven bloodline to something that can overcome a new age of glaciation. But we also see the destructiveness that war brings about, both in terms of human beings and in terms of their humanized environment as well. And the other races, we should say, too. Now, we come to the very end of this, and a very fitting end indeed. So this is from the interview with Sapkowki, Don't be a curva like Geralt. Can you tell us the exact words of Geralt's last wish? We may speculate that maybe it was about wanting to conceive an offspring with Yennefer. Now, what a great way to explain the ending here. Part of the ending, because the ending goes on beyond Geralt and Yennefer living out their last days together. Sapkowski says this: only Geralt and Yennefer know the words. They spoke so quietly I couldn't hear. But it was definitely not about any offsprings. Thinking about it during the romantic tete-a-tete would be tactless. So, a lot of ideas, reflections, clarifications by Sapkowski about this massive world and narrative that he has created. One particularly interesting philosophical theme that is, we could say, an ethical one, has to do with the value of fellowship, of companionship. And, this is kind of a standard in fantasy literature, but Geralt of Rivia tends to be a bit of a loner, right? He does, in the earlier novels, have Yennefer, the sorceress, who he's in love with and essentially will do anything for. And they have an on-again, off-again relationship, which is becoming a deep, abiding love through these novels very clearly. And he has his friend Dandelion, right, who accompanies him, gets him in trouble sometimes. Geralt and Dandelion often sort of like trade barbs with each other. And then, there's other people who kind of come and go. But in Baptism of Fire, we have something like an actual fellowship developing. And the first person is this archer, Milva, who Geralt is going to meet up with in this forest of Brokilon as he's being healed, and then going forward into his quest to find Ciri. And he thinks that she is down in the Nilfgaardian Empire because they've got a fake Ciri down there, who's supposed to be the bride of the emperor, the fiancé at the time. As it turns out, Ciri is actually in other places. And it's very interesting because he begins to attract companions. So we have him and Milva, and eventually, they meet up with these dwarves. Dandelion's going to be part of the picture before too long. And we have a couple other people. So there is this Nilfgaardian who's not a Nilfgaardian. The person who had been pursuing Ciri before, who is going to join up with the company. It's going to take a while. As a matter of fact, it's not until the very end of this book when Gerard and Cahill are fighting side by side, or Cahir, So when they're fighting against the forces, which actually is going to get Cahir injured and Geralt becoming knighted, all of that is going to sort of cement their bond. They're also going to meet up with this vampire, Regis, who's one of the very interesting character. We've already talked about this. He kind of subverts the typical vampire tropes. They're going to meet up with another person, this foul-mouthed young woman, Angoulême, and they constitute a kind of fellowship, right? Which Geralt isn't cool with. So we've got a couple really interesting conversations taking place here. We find after their conversation, Cahir had vanished into the bushes and had not reappeared. Milva and Dandelion were looking for something to eat. They'd managed to find a copper cauldron and a trug of vegetables under some nets in the boat, which had been washed up by the current. They set up a wicker trap they'd found in the boat in a riverside channel, then waded near to the bank and began hitting the rushes with sticks in order to drive fish into it. The poet was now feeling better and was strutting around as proud as a peacock with his heroically bandaged head. Gerald continued to brood and sulk. Milva and Dandelion hauled the fish pot out and began to swear. Instead of the catfish and carp they'd expected, all they saw was silvery fry wriggling around inside. The Witcher stood up. "Come over here, you two. Leave that trap and come here. I've got something to tell you." "You're returning home," he began bluntly when he came over. "Head north towards Macaham. I'm going on by myself." "What?" "Now we must go our separate ways." "The party's over, Dandelion. You're going home to write poems. Milva will lead you through the forest. What's the matter?" "Nothing's the matter," Milva said, tossing her hair from her shoulder with a sudden movement. "Nothing." "Speak, Witcher. I'd like to hear what you're going to say." Says, "I don't have anything else to say. I'll go south crossing to the Yaruga's far bank through Nilfgaardian territory. It'll be a dangerous and long journey and there's no time to waste, which is why I'm going by myself." Having got rid of the inconvenient baggage, Dandelion nodded, "the ball and chain slowing down your march and causing so many problems. In other words, me." "And me," Milva added, glancing to one side. "Listen," Geralt said, now much more calmly, "this is my own private matter. None of this concerns you. I don't want you to risk your necks for something that only concerns me." Dandelion then says, "If it only concerns you, you don't need anybody. Company impedes you and slows down your journey. You don't expect help from anybody, and you have no intention of relying on anybody. Furthermore, you love solitude. Have I forgotten anything?" "Naturally," Geralt replied angrily. "You've forgotten to swap your empty head for one with a brain. Had that arrow passed an inch to the right, you idiot, the rooks would be pecking out your eyes now. You're a poet and you've got an imagination, so try imagining a scene like that. I repeat, you're heading north and I'm heading in the opposite direction by myself." "Go on then," Milva said and sprang to her feet. "I'm not going to plead with you. Go to hell, Witcher. Come on, Dandelion, let's cook something. I'm starving and listening to him makes me sick." Geralt turned his head away. He watched the green-eyed cormorants hanging their wings out to dry. He smelled the intense scent of herbs and swore furiously, "You're trying my patience, Regis." The vampire, who had suddenly appeared out of thin air, was unconcerned and sat down alongside the furious Witcher. "I have to change the poet's dressing," he said calmly. And then he says, "I was listening to your conversation with Dandelion and the archer. I have to admit, you've got a real talent for winning people over. Though the entire world seems out to get you, you disregard the comrades and allies wanting to help you." Then Geralt says, "The world turned upside down and the vampires teaching me how to deal with humans? What do you know about humans, Regis? The only thing you know is the taste of their blood. Why am I even still talking to you?" And Regis says, "The world turned upside down. You are talking to me indeed. Perhaps you'd also like to listen to some advice." And he says, Geralt says, "No, I wouldn't. I don't need to." And then the vampire says, True, I'd forgotten. Advice is superfluous to you. Allies are superfluous. You'll get by without any traveling companions. The goal of your expedition is, after all, personal and private. More than that, the nature of the goal demands that you accomplish it alone, in person. The risks, dangers, hardships, and constant struggle with doubt must only burden you. For after all, they're components of the penance, the expiation of guilt you want to earn, a baptism of fire, I'd say. You'll pass through fire which burns but also purges, and you'll do it alone. For if someone were to support you in this, help you, take on even a scrap of that baptism of fire, that pain, that penance, they would, by the same token, impoverish you. They would deprive you of part of the expiation you desire, which would be owed them for their involvement. Only you have a debt to pay off, and you don't want to run up debts with other creditors at the same time. Is my logic correct? Gerald says, surprisingly so, considering you're sober. Your presence annoys me, vampire. Leave me alone with my expiation, please, and with my debt. And then he's going to say, sit and think. I will give you some advice anyway. A sense of guilt as well as the need for expiation aren't things you can claim an exclusive right to. Life differs from banking's because it has debts which are paid off by running up debts with others. So this is really an interesting revelation there, right? So, Gerald, why doesn't he want these people coming along? In part because it's his debt, it's his thing. He also doesn't want to place them in harm's way. And he knows that by them choosing to go along with him, they will be in harm's way. And Regis is pointing something out to him that's very important. This isn't realistic. People do, in fact, care for you, Gerald, and they're willing, that's the key term, to come along with you. A little bit later in that same chapter, we read some really interesting stuff. So they're discussing what they're going to do as they're eating this fish stew. And Regis says, reaching the destination and rescuing her seemed beyond our powers about Ciri. Now hearing Cahir's revelation, we have no idea where Ciri is. And then Milva says, what are we to do then? Milva said, bridling. The Witcher insists on going south. And Regis said, well, for him, the points of the compass have no meaning. He can go anywhere. And he says, I was joking. You're right, dear Milva. Ciri is our goal. And since we don't know where she is, it would make sense to find that out and direct our activities accordingly, right? And so they talk about going to the Druids' circle and finding out the information. And then Gerald says, don't any of you think that you should ask me my opinion? Because it's his quest, after all. And Dandelion says, you haven't a clue what you're doing. You owe even the soup you gobbled down to us. Were it not for us, you'd be hungry. We would be too, had we waited for you to act. That cauldron of soup was the result of cooperation, of teamwork, the joint efforts of a fellowship united by a common goal. Get it, friend? And then Milva says, how could he get it? He's just me, by myself, all alone, a lone wolf. But you can see he's no hunter. He's a stranger to the forest. Wolves don't hunt alone. Never. A lone wolf would twaddle foolish towny nonsense. But he doesn't understand that. And then Regis says, oh, he does. He does. And so what do we have going on here? The realization that the Witcher isn't independent. He needs these other people. And this makes him vulnerable to the world in kind of a special way. Tower of Swallows, we get an interesting discussion about Angoulême, who's now part of their company. And he says, correct me if I'm wrong, but that girl who we've cheerfully and carelessly added to our company is a criminal. To save her from her well-deserved penalty, you've agreed to collaborate with Nilfgaardians. You hired yourself out. Not just yourself, you hired all of us. We are to assist the Nilfgaardians capture or kill somebody, some local brigand. In short, you've become a mercenary, a bounty hunter, a hired assassin, and we've been promoted to the rank of your acolytes. Or perhaps your fam. And then Cahill says, you have an incredible talent for oversimplification, Dandelion. Have you not really understood what this is all about? Or are you just talking for talking's sake? And then, they're discussing how this is going to work. And the Witcher says, no one's forced to help me with my plans. I can handle it by myself without acolytes or family. And Angoulême says, you're audacious, nuncle, but Nightingale's Hansa numbers 24 stout blades. They won't take fright at a Witcher and where it concerns swordmanship. Even if it were true what they say about Witchers, no Witcher could deal with 24 by himself. You saved my life. I'll repay you likewise, with a warning and with help. Right? So she's a recent addition, but she wants to help them out. We see another discussion of this, uniting into a band in Lady of the Lake. And this is after Milva, goes off and is kind of upset. So the rest of the company ate in silence. Angoulême says, I have a small problem. And the sorceress Fringalla is saying, oh, well, I can cure that. And she says, no, it's not that kind of problem. What is it? Geralt wants to leave me here when he goes back on the road. He says he can't put me at risk and similar rubbish, and I want to go with him. Don't interrupt me. I want to go with him with Geralt because it's only with him. I'm not afraid that One-Eyed Falco will catch me. And here in Toussaint, and, they have some more discussion about this. And the idea is that everybody should be working with each other. Fringella, who's kind of working at cross purposes, says the Witcher should not leave Toussaint. No one who wishes him well should encourage him to do that. He's living in the lap of luxury. He's got his monsters to hunt. He's earning good money from it. His friend and comrade is the favorite of the reigning Duchess, and the Duchess herself is favorably disposed to him, right? So we have an interesting argument being made there, but they are, in fact, going to go off. And what we're going to see is that the company, Angoulême, Milva, Regis, Cahill, they're all going to go with Geralt on this very dangerous journey and then attack, and all of them will give up their lives for Geralt's quest. Geralt almost dies as well, but, they prove themselves genuinely faithful companions. I think that this is a really important central philosophical theme. Geralt himself has to learn at bitter cost what fellowship actually means. Another very interesting theme running throughout this, which we could call both ethical and metaphysical, has to do with Ciri, or Cirilla, and what it is that's in her blood, which makes her an object of desire and plans for 4 different groups working at cross purposes with each other. And so this is, you could say, a subversion of the chosen one trope, and there's some really interesting resonances with other series where genetics play an important role. So we learn in Baptism of Fire, we hear about the story of Lara and Cregennan, and we are told, so this is a narration. It's a true story, though it's overgrown with fairy tale ornamentation and it's difficult to recognize. There's enormous variance between the legend's human and elven versions. Chauvinism and racial hatred can be heard in both of them, so I'm going to refrain from embellishments and limit myself to dry facts. Cregennan of Lod was a sorcerer. Lara Doran Aip Sidhal was an elven sorceress. A sage, one of the carriers of the elder blood, which is mysterious even to us elves. Their friendship and later romance between the two was joyfully acknowledged at first by both races, but there soon appeared opponents to their union. sworn enemies to the idea of melding human and elven magic, who regarded it as betrayal. With the wisdom of hindsight, there were also feuds of a personal nature at work, jealousy and envy. Put simply, Creganon was assassinated, and Laura Doran, hounded and hunted, died of exhaustion in a wilderness after giving birth to a daughter. The baby was saved by a miracle. She was taken in by Cyril, the queen of Redania. And we go on. The prophetic abilities of the sages of the elder blood are facts, right? And there's, I'm not going to go through all of the twists and turns told in the story, but what we find out a little bit later is that this involves genes. So we read that these genes can be passed only inviolably down the female line. If the carrier is a man, the gene disappears in the second or at most the third generation, but it activates later, right? So there's actually two genes involved. One, the true gene, was latent quiescent, but there's also an activator gene, which travels down the male line as well. And so, they're like, well, what does all this mean, right? And what's going on here is that Ciri is somebody who is going to possess some great power, as we'll find out, right? So how can they get this? How can they use this? Why are they hunting Ciri? And we do hear this. There's no question Emhyr, the Nilfgaardian emperor, had been hunting for Cirilla for many years. Everyone assumed his goal was a political union and control of the fiefdom, which is their legal heritage. However, one cannot rule out, rather than politics, it concerns the gene of the elder blood, which Emhyr wants to introduce to the imperial line. If Emhyr knows what we do, he may want the prophecy to manifest itself in his dynasty, and in the future queen of the world to be born in Nilfgaard. And then we read a correction. Sabrina Glesevig interrupted. It's not Emhyr who wants it, but the Nilfgaardian sorcerers. They alone were capable of tracking down the gene and making Emhyr aware of its significance. I'm sure the Nilfgaardian ladies here present will want to confirm that and explain their role in the intrigue, right? So we find out that this is quite important. And what does this gene actually do? Well, towards the end of Tower of Swallows, we learn from Ciri's encounter with her now dead protector and friend, Visgota, who is going to tell her what it is. So he says, what I've learned is important, what I've worked out. Here's what I know about you. The elder blood that flows in your veins gives you power over time and over space, over the dimensions and the spheres. You are now master of the world, Ciri. You have a mighty power. Do not let criminals or rogues take it from you and use it to their own ends. Right? So she can go from world to world, and as it's going to turn out, she will. Now, this is where, in Lady of the Lake, we discover there's essentially 4 different factions that want to use Ciri and her genetic material. So one is Vilgefortz, who is in alignment with some disaffected Nilfgaardian nobles, but who's really doing his own thing. He's a great sorcerer, and he wants to make use of her in a way that we'll talk about in a bit. There's also the elves, who are not the elves in this, in not our world, but in the world of The Witcher, but elves in a different world who want to use it as well. There is the Nilfgaardian Emperor, Emhyr, who we'll talk about shortly. And then the League of Sorceresses also want to make use of this, and they have their own plans. So let's take a look at what we find out in Lady of the Lake. So we're told that here's the encounter between Ciri and these elves, right, who are telling her things. So it's revealed to her that there are all sorts of worlds that she can go to. And he says, a bubble beside a bubble and another beside another. That's how it was. We used to say to ourselves, well, what's the difference? We'll spend some time here, some time there. What if the Leguin insist, that's the humans, on destroying their world along with themselves? We'll go somewhere else to another bubble, right? But the conjunction came, and the door is closed. It's closed to all apart from a handful of chosen ones, and time is passing. The door ought to be opened. It's urgent. It's imperative. Do you understand that? And she says, I'm not stupid. And he says, no, you aren't. You can't be, because you're Iain hen Ichar of the Alder blood, right? So this is the Alder king. And she finds out that they are saying that the world that she's from is going to be destroyed. We have more than serious grounds to suppose your world is in danger of destruction by a climatic cataclysm of immense scale. So this is Ilithan's prophecy. There's talk of white frost in the prophecy. According to us, it concerns extreme glaciation, which would endanger the existence of most living creatures and the breakdown of society into barbarism. Remember the text of the prophecy, the time of contempt, the time of the battle axe, the time of the wolfish blizzard. The child that matters so much to us, continued Alvahak, who wants to do experiments on her, the descendant and bearer of the Laradoran gene, the gene that was specially constructed by us, may save the Denzians of that world. We have reason to believe that the descendant of Lara and of you naturally will possess abilities 1,000-fold more powerful than that which we, the knowing ones, possess and you possess in rudimentary form. You know what this is all about. So they want to get her pregnant and then take the child. That's kind of a common theme in this. Vilgefortz doesn't even really want to get her pregnant and take the child. He just wants something else as a byproduct. So he tells her, I'm terribly attracted by power. It's crude, I know, but I want to be a ruler before whom people will bow down, whom people will bless simply because I let them be, whom they will worship as a god if I decide to save their world from a cataclysm, even if I only save it on a whim. And so he says, the child of destiny, now all mine. Various fools and mystics have tried to adapt you to fairy tales, legends, and prophecies, have tracked the genes you carry, your inheritance from your ancestors. Mistaking the sky for stars reflected in the surface of a pond, they mystically supposed a gene determining great potential would continue to evolve. It would achieve the height of power in your child or the child of your child, and a charming aura grew around you. But the truth is much more banal, more mundane, organically mundane. Your blood is important, but in the absolutely literal, quite unpoetic sense of the word. So he says, you will be impregnated. It won't be so awful because you'll be befuddled by elixirs, with the aim of implanting the fetal ovum properly and ruling out an ectopic pregnancy. Now, the important thing, it may worry you or it may gratify you to know that you won't give birth to the infant. Who knows? Maybe it would have been a great chosen one with extraordinary abilities, savior of the world, king of nations. No one can guarantee that, and I have no intention of waiting that long. I need blood, more precisely placental blood. As soon as the placenta develops, I will remove it from you. So that's what Vilgefortz is up to in this. He is defeated, and the Witcher's companions are all killed. The Witcher and Yennefer survive, and then the Emperor, Emhyr var Emrys, shows up. And Geralt says, and here's the big reveal, I'm not sure if you haven't traveled further, Dunny. Dunny is actually the father of Ciri. Thought lost, right? And he is the Emperor of Nilfgaard as well. So, the Emperor says, oh, you recognized me. And He says, "You've saved my daughter's life several times. I thank you for that on behalf of myself and posterity. Cyrilla will go to Nilfgaard. She will become empress at a suitable moment." Right? She'll be happy. It will come with time. Cyrilla will transfer the love I do not demand onto the son that I will beget with her. So he wants to commit incest with his own daughter. Why? Because it's going to be, generating this amazing queen of the world person. And, this is not something that The Witcher is actually in favor of. And he actually tells him, "Thank you for the conversation, Dunny. I've watched all the death of my friends. They came to rescue your daughter. Except for Cahir, none of them even knew Ciri. But they came here to rescue her because there's something in her that was decent and noble. What happened? They found death. I consider that unjust. I don't agree with it. Summon your men." And he says, "Witcher." And he says, "The secret has to die with those who know it. You don't have a choice. It's not true that you have plenty of them. I'll escape from any prison. I'll take Ciri from you. There's no price I wouldn't pay to take her away." Right? So, this is another wrinkle to the plot. And then finally we get the League of Sorceresses who are talking to Ciri, and they have their own plans for her. As we read here, they are much wiser than she is. And they say, this is Sheila, "You were right in thinking you were summoned here to be informed about your fate. You're not right to think you are nothing, for you are everything. You are the future of this world. At this moment, you don't know that, can't know that. At this moment, you're a puffed up and spitting kitten, a traumatized child who sees in everybody Emhirvar, Emrys, or Vilgefortz holding his inseminator. And there's no point now at this moment explaining to you that you're mistaken, that it concerns your good and the good of the world. The time will come for such explanations. Now you don't want to listen to the voice of reason." And then she says, "Inform the girl of her fate, Philippa." And what is the fourth option? "You will go to Kovir with Sheila and I to Point Vannis, the royal summer capital. Because you are no longer Cyrilla of Cintra, you'll be presented at the audience as a novice in magic, our pupil. At the audience, you will meet a very wise king, Esterad Tussin, of genuine royal blood. You will meet his queen. You will meet the royal couple's son, Prince Tancred." Ciri, beginning to understand, opened her eyes widely. "Yes, you must make an impression on Prince Tancred above all, for you will become his lover and bear his child." So once again, she's going to be used for her genetic material. She is actually going to say, "I'll go along with your plans, but I have to be allowed to go say goodbye to the Witcher. And so, you'll have to let me go for a little bit." And when they let her go, of course, she's going to go somewhere else. Things are going to get kind of complicated. And they take a vote. And as it turns out, she's actually allowed, at least we think she is, to leave. And she's not going to go along with any of these plans. She's going to go off to a different world and meet up with Galahad and end the story there. The tale of the Witcher ends, and I wanted to bring up some parts that particularly moved me. This is often called a grim, dark fantasy setting, but there is some real poignancy and goodness that is reflected in all of the damage and danger and corruption that we see depicted. And some of these things can, I'll admit, as I was reading them, bring me to appreciative tears. So I'm going to bring up three particular passages. One is a encounter between elves who belong to the commando units, who are now starving, filthy, stinking, and humans who are also, wounded and don't have much themselves. And something happens. So the invalids on the wagon, petrified and frozen in their tracks, suddenly twitched as though animated by a magic spell. Why? Because one of the elves asked them for food. And the peasant girl, who had been familiar from childhood with the apparition of famine, reacted instinctively and unerringly. She held out the bread towards the elf woman. The invalids then brought out quarter loaves of bread, rounds of cheese, pieces of fatback and sausage. They all appeared as if by magic in the hands that held out towards the elves. And for the first time in 1,000 years, elves were holding their hands out towards humans. And as Lucien and Jari were the first people to see elves crying, to see them choking on their sobs, not even trying to wipe away the tears flowing down their dirty faces, giving the lie to the claim that elves supposedly had no lacrimal glands at all. The elf repeats, Enca digne, and then he held out a hand and took the bread from Corncrake. Thank you, he said hoarsely, struggling to adapt his lips and tongue to the foreign language. Thank you, human. So, it shows mercy, which I think is, a very important quality that we don't lose. We're also going to find out another rather poignant scene. Ciri is coming back to the town where her friends were killed and she was abused so terribly. And she's asking them, where were these people buried? You'll show me the place where these boys and girls were buried. And so Pegleg takes her there, and he says, this is our jealousy boneyard here in this grove, and the ones you were asking about, Miss Falca, they lie over there. The girl looked long at the small barrow. It was orderly, level, tidy, edged by blocks of sandstone and slabs of spar and slate. The fir branches that the burial mound had been decorated with had turned brown. The flowers that had been there laid were dry and yellowed. Who? She asked dully. Well, many jealousy people helped, but chiefly the widow Golu and young Niklar. The widow was always a good and sincere dame, and Niklar, his dreams tormented him terribly. They wouldn't give him rest until he'd given the murdered ones a decent funeral. Where will I find them, the widow and Niklar? Pegleg said nothing for a long time. The widow is buried there beyond the crooked little birch. She died of pneumonia in the winter of the year. And Niklar joined the army somewhere in foreign parts. Folk say he fell in the war. She approached the small burial mound and knelt down, or rather fell on one knee. She bent over low, very low, her forehead almost touching the stones around the base. Pegleg saw the white-haired man make a movement as though meaning to dismount, but the black-haired woman caught him by the arm, stopping him with a gesture and a look. So, this is really quite remarkable. And she tells him, my name's not Falca, it's actually Ciri. And then Yennefer says, grace, gratitude, and reward have befallen you and your entire settlement, for the burial mound, for your humanity, for your human dignity and decency. And then, how does the story actually end? Geralt is killed, and Yennefer tries to heal him, to bring him back to life, but she can't. She defends him, fallen from the crowd who's engaged, trying to kill the dwarves, engaging in atrocities. Ciri shows up, and the unicorn shows up, and they use their power to kind of heal him. And they put them on a boat, right? And the boat is taking them to somewhere else. How does it actually end? Well, besides the part with Ciri and Galahad, here's how the story of Geralt and Yennefer ends. Geralt opened his eyes. He saw leaves above him, a kaleidoscope of leaves flickering in the sun. He saw branches heavy with apples. He felt the soft touch of fingers on his temple and cheek, fingers he knew, fingers he loved so much it hurt. His belly and chest hurt. His ribs hurt, and the tight corset of bandages left him no doubt that the town of Rivia and the three-fanged trident hadn't been a nightmare. "Lie still, my darling," Yennefer said gently. "Lie still, don't move. Where are we, Yen? Is it important we're together? You and me. Where's Ciri? She's gone away." "We were with Ciri on a boat," he recalled, "on a lake, then on a river with a strong current in a fog." "Lie still, my darling. Lie still, I'm beside you. It doesn't matter what happened. Doesn't matter where we were. Now I'm beside you and I'll never leave you. Never. See, it affects me even now. I love you, Yen, I know. All the same," he sighed, "I'd like to know where we are." "Me too," Yennefer said, quietly and not right away. And then they're asked, is that the end of the story? That's Galahad asking. And she says, well, no, they had a great wedding, but that's kind of made up. This is how it draws to a close, with reflections of mercy, gratitude, humanity, and love. So, what a fitting end to this great saga of The Witcher and Yennefer and Ciri and all of their companions.